Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this emergency debate. Many of my colleagues who have had the opportunity to visit Atlantic Canada, in particular New Brunswick Southwest, know of our traditional fishing communities. All members from our region, even those who represent ridings that do not border the oceans, understand that at the core of Atlantic Canada is a sustainable fishing industry. Quotas, licenses, zones, and enforcement form a complex set of rules and regulations that ensure our waters can be fished for another generation and another generation after that, long into the future. This emergency debate is entitled Fisheries in Nova Scotia, but in fact it impacts all Atlantic Canada. So what is being contested here in Parliament and down east? It isn't the Supreme Court of Canada's rulings. I don't believe I've heard anyone back home dispute the legitimacy of the Marshall decisions. The unacceptable violence Canadians have witnessed is to be condemned. That too is agreed. But make no mistake, the ongoing pressure cooker we are witnessing on our East Coast could have been de-escalated by Canada's fishery ministers and the federal government, specifically by adhering to the Marshall decisions and bringing affected fishing families to the table. This didn't happen. Instead, fishing is happening out of season. Now, fishing seasons are normally rigorously enforced by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, but not now, just as the regulated season is set to begin. People are confused and they are worried. I do not condone the destruction of property, and Indigenous communities have the constitutional rights that have been spelled out by the courts. Moreover, they have the right to live safely like every other Canadian in this country, which is why we can understand both how Indigenous peoples are anxious to exercise rights and also how non-Indigenous fisheries throughout Atlantic Canada are asking how decisions made in a far-away capital could impact them, their communities, and their way of life. They haven't received a reply. Economist and social theorist Thomas Sowell once said, "The first lesson of economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything to satisfy all those who want it." And as we know, the first lesson of politics is too often to disregard the first lesson of economics. Too many fishing communities worry the federal government is biased against them and their way of life and will make them pay the bill for Canada's neglect of Indigenous peoples. Canada's opposition leader raised the deteriorating situation with the PM on September 18th and urged the federal government to de-escalate tensions and find a solution. Maritime MPs could hear and see what was happening. This is true in Nova Scotia, it's true in PEI, and it was true in New Brunswick. Many of us raised these concerns in our caucuses and in the House, but time and time again, the federal fisheries minister failed to respond. Today, after violence, confusion, uncertainty, we have this emergency debate. This is a record of failure, not leadership. So what must we do moving forward? In fact, my Liberal colleague from Malpeque touched on this. A necessary first step is for all members to understand the two Marshall decisions, those rights as well as responsibilities. The Supreme Court of Canada was clear. Treaty rights are subject to federal regulations. The court stressed the priority of conservation and the responsibility to administer them belongs to the minister, not on Indigenous or non-Indigenous fishing communities. Nova Scotia Liberal Premier Stephen McNeil is also out calling on the federal government to do its job. He said, "The quickest way and the best way to reduce tension is to have the federal minister and the department at the table with both sides at the same time." He is correct. First Nations are entitled to be consulted about management on the exercise of their treaty rights, as laid out in Marshall. And similarly, Canada's fisheries minister should be discussing her vision with Canadians, including our fishing communities. The fisheries minister has said she is in discussion with fishing associations. I do not believe this is true, unless she thinks one-way communication is dialogue. But that is not real dialogue, nor is it fair play. The minister has hired a retired DFO employee as a negotiator with 34 Indigenous bands, yet no similar outreach has been made with commercial fishers. Finally, and importantly, Canada's Fisheries Minister must stop relinquishing her duty on enforcement. DFO officers are highly trained and capable peace officers. The RCMP is no replacement, and in fact, I believe once disputes are off the water and on the land, we've already missed the boat on solving this problem peacefully. Atlantic Canada needs unbiased federal leadership, and it must offer this leadership while still recognizing the obligation Canada has towards the two groups. These groups are different, their expectations are different, but they both need to be respected. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I want to close my remarks by identifying a clear point to the government. Indigenous communities are already part of Canada's traditional regulated fishing communities. It started small, it's growing, but it is happening. They hold licenses, they adhere to DFO guidelines, and they follow the rules. When the government works in silos to change the rules of the game, it is working to undermine the progress that has already been made. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Question commentaire, the Honourable Member for Mission Matsqui, Fraser Canyon.
I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for his very, very important speech and the insight he provided as an Atlantic Canadian in tonight's discourse. I'd like to ask the member specifically what the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans could do right now to get over this severe lack of leadership in this sad debate we're forced to have in this House of Commons tonight when she should be meeting with the people already. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Thank you, and I thank my colleague for his question. The most important thing the minister could do, the federal fisheries minister could do, would be to reach out and sit down with the fishing communities throughout Atlantic Canada. It's as simple as that. Many of these families invest considerable amount of their savings every year into the fishing industry. Those seasons are set to open, yet they're not sure how the season's going to operate. So the minister could sit down with these individuals, these families, and assure them that the federal government has their welfare at its focus, along with First Nations.
Is there comments? The Honourable Parliament Secretary to the Minister of Small Business and Export Promotion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And let me begin just by saying how wonderful it is to also have, as part of this debate, my colleague from Sydney, Victoria, who spoke earlier, and of course is a member of the Mi'kmaq community, and how important it is to have a member of the Mi'kmaq community as part of this House and expressing the views of his people. To my honourable colleague who just gave a very eloquent speech, I do have a question for him. He alluded to the fact that several Indigenous fishermen are using licenses, and I wonder if he is implying that because of this we should not be respecting the treaty rights that the Supreme Court has recognized.
For New Brunswick Southwest.
No, not at all. In fact, it was the Prime Minister who earlier tonight pointed out that these steps that were taken by previous governments were in line with the Marshall decision. And in fact, the Marshall decision, the second ruling that came down from the courts, stipulated the federal government, when it came to a moderate living, had an obligation to be involved, to set the parameters, particularly on conservation, and not, and please, asked the member from Malpeque about this. He did a report on it in the 1990s that the federal government has a duty to be involved to safeguard the industry, and the Supreme Court upheld that duty in the Marshall decisions.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member by video conference. The Honourable Member for Courtenay Alberni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for decades, we've seen Supreme Court decisions that favor Indigenous rights, and we see the government ignore these rights-based decisions that are in the courts, that are enshrined in the Constitution, or they take years to implement. But as soon as a nation loses in court or their right or gets diminished, there's a regulation and policy in place within weeks. But when it's a nation that wins, the government drags their feet. Does my colleague not see this as a problem? The Conservatives spent millions of dollars fighting Indigenous fishing rights in the Housat case, tens of millions of dollars. Does he not respect that Indigenous fishing rights are different, that they're an inherent right and privilege, and they're not the same as commercial fishing rights? And I hope he'll recognize that.
Port of Brunswick Southwest.
In fact, Mr. Speaker, I do recognize that, but I've also read both Marshall decisions and recognize there are limitations set on both parties. Neither side has a carte blanche to behave or to act as they would wish. This has to be done through negotiations. And I can't speak to what's happened on the West Coast, but I can speak to what's happened on the East Coast. And the federal government has spent millions of dollars to bring First Nations into the regulated fishing industry. It hasn't been easy, but that's the work that's been done. And today we see fishing families from different communities working side by side under the rules every year.
Last question by video conference, the Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my friend from New Brunswick Southwest. It seems to me, looking at the lobster fishery, which of course is a very significant industry for the region, that the large monopolistic holdings by Clearwater are a giant against a very small mouse of what First Nations are allowed to fish. And I know some of the fishing is in partnership between Clearwater and Mi'kmaq fishers. But the question is this: the clear violation of conservation rules, the largest violations ignoring DFO restrictions to protect the lobster fishery have been those of Clearwater. And I don't see non-Indigenous fishermen protesting Clearwater. I only see them protesting Indigenous fishermen. And I wonder if my friend from New Brunswick Southwest has any comments on how this is allowed, how this has developed, because I know most non-Indigenous fishermen are anything but welcoming to Indigenous fishermen. They want to work in partnership.
The Honourable Member for New Brunswick Southwest.
So I agree that there is room for a lot of partnership. I do take exception that the non-Indigenous fishing community wants the rules maintained on owner-operator, which means the owner of the license is the person that fishes. And this runs against the idea of a large corporate fisheries. But no, I would urge the member to come out after our bubble opens up and visit us, and we'll take you around to meet some of the traditional fisheries from communities. They want to hold those licenses and fish them. They don't want to give them up to commercial interest.